You ever see a national budget? We're talking trillions of dollars and just wonder, how does that even work? I mean, how does a government juggle that much money without completely crashing and burning? Well, let's get into it, because the answer is all about a hidden architecture that keeps countries from going broke. And it's a really good question, right? When you're dealing with numbers that have like 12 zeros, one tiny mistake can turn into an absolute catastrophe. So what's the safety net? What are the rules of the road that keep a country from just driving right off a fiscal cliff? That's exactly what we're going to unpack. Okay, so at the very heart of all of this is one simple universal problem. Every single person, every government department, every city, they all have needs and wants. Better hospitals, new bridges, stronger schools, you name it. The demands are basically infinite. But the money? Well, the money is very, very finite. The entire game of public finance is about solving this one epic dilemma. Now, to wrestle with this problem, governments have historically tried two completely opposite approaches. First, you've got top-down budgeting. This is where the big boss, usually the Ministry of Finance, looks at the whole economy, figures out what the country can realistically afford, and sets a hard limit on spending. It's all about stability. Then you've got the total opposite, bottom-up. This is where every single agency and department adds up what they think they need, and that giant wish list becomes the budget. The focus there is all about delivering services on the ground. So, which one's better? Well, it turns out the smartest way is to not pick a side at all. The most effective systems today use a hybrid approach. The top sets a firm, non-negotiable spending limit. That's your discipline. But inside that limit, the individual agencies use their real-world expertise to figure out the best way to spend the money. You get the best of both worlds, fiscal control from the top and smart, effective services from the bottom. But here's the thing. Even with this perfect-sounding system, there's a villain lurking in the shadows, a hidden force that can wreck all that careful planning. It's this insidious problem that keeps finance ministers up at night, and it's called the soft budget trap. Now, the key word here, the one you really got to focus on, is expectation. A soft budget constraint isn't actually a law or a rule on the books. It's a belief. It's what happens when a city or a state-owned company or a public university overspends, just assuming that at the end of the day, the central government will have to step in and rescue them. And that belief, that one belief, changes absolutely everything. The economist who came up with this term, Yanis Kornai, he put it perfectly. He said this expectation acts like a cancer. And why a cancer? Because if everyone just believes they'll get bailed out, what's the incentive to be careful with money? Why make tough choices if you know someone else is just going to pick up the tab? It completely eats away at the credibility of the entire system. And this cancer, it shows up in some very specific ways. Sometimes it's a straight-up after-the-fact bailout. Other times it's way more subtle, like the government just looking the other way when a big industry doesn't pay its taxes. Or maybe it's state-owned banks giving out huge loans that they know, deep down, are never, ever getting paid back. It's a slow poison to a country's financial health. So how do you fight back against this? How do you enforce real discipline? You have to build a better system. You create something called a Macro-Fiscal Framework, or an MFF. Think of this as the government's master plan, its rulebook for staying solvent. It's the architecture that's designed to defend against financial chaos. The central goal of this whole framework is to figure out how much fiscal space the country actually has. And listen, fiscal space isn't just about having cash in the bank. It's about the sustainable room you have to fund new, important things, like maybe a new green energy program or universal health care, without gambling with the country's long-term financial stability. It's your room to maneuver. So if a government wants to do something new, it has to create this space. And there are really only 4 ways to do it. 1, you can raise more revenue, through taxes. 2, you can cut spending somewhere else and shift the money over. 3, you can borrow, but you have to do it sustainably. Or 4, for some countries, you can get grants from international partners. That's it. There's no magic 5th option. And this, wow, this really shows you what that looks like in the real world. This is a snapshot from back in 2011, and it shows countries at 2 totally different extremes. Over on one side, you have Australia with massive fiscal space, over 200%. That meant it had incredible power to respond to a crisis with huge stimulus packages. But on the other end, you see Italy, which had negative space. They had already run out of room to maneuver before their financial crisis even hit its peak. Okay, so that's all the theory. Now for the fun part. Let's see how this actually plays out on the ground. We're going to look at 2 very different countries that have built their own blueprints for handling this exact problem: New Zealand and the Philippines. All right, first up is New Zealand, which a lot of people consider the gold standard in this area. Their entire approach is about creating a hard budget constraint. And they don't mess around. They enforce it through total transparency and the actual force of law. Their Public Finance Act legally requires the government to publish all its spending plans and limits way in advance, which makes it incredibly difficult for politicians to just change their minds later. And here's the crucial part. This is how they make it real. For their 2026 budget, the government has already set a fixed, legally binding cap for all new spending at just $2.4 billion. That's it. That pot of money is fixed, so if a minister wants to fund a new program that costs more than their share, they can't just go ask for more money. They have to find savings from their own existing programs to pay for it. It forces everyone to make real trade-offs. Okay, now let's jump over and contrast that with the Philippines. They face a totally different reality, so they use this very clever administrative system called the two-tier budgeting approach. They're trying to carve out some strategic space for new projects, but they're doing it within a much more rigid budget structure. And this chart really says it all. It shows the incredible scale of their challenge. See, their budget is split into two tiers. Tier 1 is just the cost of keeping the lights on. Government salaries, debt payments, all the existing programs. And as you can see, that Tier 1 spending plus other automatic costs eats up almost 90% of the entire budget before a single new idea is even considered. In fact, the squeeze is so intense that in some years, they've actually had negative fiscal space. Now just let that sink in for a second. That means the cost of just running the existing government is growing faster than the entire budget is allowed to grow. So to fund anything new, they first have to go find and cut old, outdated programs just to get back to zero. So to cope with this, they have to be incredibly smart about managing their debt. And here you can see their strategy in action, an 80-20 borrowing mix. They intentionally borrow 80% of their money from right there at home in their own currency, the peso. Why do they do that? Well, it basically acts like an insurance policy. If the US dollar suddenly skyrockets, it doesn't blow a giant hole in their budget because most of their debt is safe from those wild currency swings. So after all of this, top-down, bottom-up, soft constraints, fiscal space, what's the one big lesson we should take away from all this? Why does any of this complex stuff actually matter in our daily lives? It all boils down to one simple, powerful idea: trade-offs. There's this fantastic classroom exercise where you're given 100 pennies and told, okay, you run the country now. And you realize that if you want to put one more penny into education, you have to physically pick it up and take it away from somewhere else, from defense, from healthcare, from infrastructure. There is no magic pile of extra pennies. That, right there, is a hard budget constraint in its purest form. And that really brings us to the fundamental truth of public finance. A national budget is not a wish list. It's not just a collection of noble goals or great ideas. At its absolute core, the budget is a mathematical constraint, and a country's success or failure often hangs on how well its leaders respect that simple math. Which leads me to a final question for you. If you were handed those 100 pennies, with all the competing, desperate needs of a nation resting on your choices, where would you put them? What would you choose to build? And more importantly, what would you be forced to sacrifice?